There is a season your ancestors could not run from, could not fight, and could not outwork. It arrived on schedule every year for hundreds of thousands of years, and it took a portion of every group it touched. What's strange is that surviving it had almost nothing to do with toughness. The strongest person in the band was no more likely to see spring than anyone else. Because winter didn't test bodies. It tested a decision made months earlier by people who couldn't yet feel the cold coming. To understand why, you have to see the trap winter actually sets, and it isn't the one people imagine. Cold makes your body more expensive to run. Holding a stable internal temperature in a freezing environment takes energy continuously, whether you are working or lying still. The furnace has to keep burning or you die. So a body in deep winter needs meaningfully more fuel than the same body in summer simply to stay alive and do nothing. Now, look at what winter does to the supply. The plants are gone. No fruit. No greens. Nothing seeding anywhere. The ground freezes hard enough that roots and tubers become effectively locked away. Many animals migrate out entirely, and the ones that stay are lean, scattered, and hard to find in open country. That gives a hunter nowhere to hide. The fishing closes under ice. The insects vanish. An entire landscape that fed a group all summer simply stops producing, all at once, for months. Put those two facts together and you have the deadliest arithmetic in human history. The body's demand goes up, the landscape supply goes to nearly zero, and the gap between them has to be crossed. Not for a bad week, not for a difficult stretch, but for 3 or 4 months without interruption, which means something that reframes the entire question. You cannot solve winter during winter. There is no amount of effort, courage, cleverness, or endurance that produces calories from a frozen landscape that does not contain any. Work harder and you only burn through your reserves faster. By the time the snow is down, the range of possible outcomes has already been narrowed to whatever is sitting in storage. So, the real survival happens in autumn. Picture a group in late autumn, standing over everything they own. Dried meat, rendered fat, nuts, seeds, roots. The accumulated result of a summer's work piled in one place. And somebody is counting. Not with numbers as you'd use them, but counting all the same. This much food, this many people, this many moons, until the ground softens. Everyone standing there understands that if the count is wrong, they will find out in February when there is nothing anyone can do about it. That is the moment winter is decided. Not in January, when the cold is at its worst. And everyone can feel the danger, but here, in the last mild weeks, while there is still light and the ground is still soft, and the decision contains 4 separate problems, each of which had to be solved without a single one of the tools you would reach for. The first problem is simply knowing how much is enough. Think about what that estimate actually requires. You need to predict how long the cold will last. In a world with no calendar, no records, and no way to write anything down, you need to know how much food a person consumes over months, which nobody has ever measured. You need to guess how bad this particular winter will be, when weather is not something anyone can forecast. And you need to make all of those estimates in autumn, and then live with the answer. The only instrument available for this was memory. Not one person's memory, but the group's. And specifically, the memory held by its oldest members. Someone who has lived through 40 winters is carrying a data set that nobody else in the band possesses. Which years the cold arrived early, and what the sky had looked like in the weeks beforehand, how far a given quantity of stores actually stretched during the winter the snow lasted longest, which animals could still be found in the worst months, and where, and what happened to the group in the year they judged it badly. None of that could be written down, checked, or reconstructed. It lived in living minds, and it was transmitted by being spoken aloud, repeatedly, to people who would need it decades later. This is one of the clearest reasons human societies came to treat their elders as something close to sacred. In a mild and stable environment, long experience is useful but not essential. A clever young person can work most things out. In an environment that sets out to kill everyone once a year on a completely predictable schedule, long experience stops being an advantage and becomes infrastructure. The old woman who remembers a hard winter from her childhood is the closest thing that group has to a written record, and when she dies, the group loses part of its ability to calibrate the single most consequential estimate anybody makes all year. Consider what that means about the shape of those societies. A band that keeps its elders alive and listened to is a band that inherits decades of hard-won calibration for free. A band that loses them, or ignores them, is making the autumn calculation from scratch every generation with nothing but this year's intuition to go on. Across enough winters, the difference between those two situations is the difference between a lineage that continues and one that doesn't. The second problem is holding onto what you've gathered. And here, winter does something almost mocking. The season that starves you is also the season that preserves food perfectly. Cold is a storage technology. Below freezing, decay effectively stops the bacteria that would ruin a summer kill simply cease to function. So the very conditions creating the shortage are the conditions that make a surplus keepable. Ancient people used this ruthlessly. Meat could be cached in frozen ground, in dug pits, under heavy stone, in shaded places where the temperature stayed reliably low, and animals could not easily reach it. In the far north, the permafrost itself functioned as an enormous natural cold store. Frozen ground pressed into service as a pantry by people who had mapped its behavior in complete practical detail without possessing any theory whatsoever of why cold should stop rot. But a cache creates its own problems, and they are not small ones. It has to be concealed from scavengers, which are hungry too, and which are considerably better at smelling buried meat than any human is at hiding it. So a cache raided in December is not an inconvenience. It is a death sentence discovered in advance. It has to be findable again months later, in deep snow, in a landscape that has been completely transformed by weather, with every track and marker long since buried. And most consequentially of all, it anchors the group to a location. Once a band's entire survival is sitting in a pit 3 days' walk away, that band is no longer free to move, no longer able to follow opportunity, or flee a bad situation, because leaving means abandoning the only thing standing between them and starvation. This is why cold season settlements tend to form around their caches rather than anywhere else. People settle where the food already is, because the food cannot come to them. The third problem is the one people find hardest to accept, because it isn't about food at all. It's about who eats. In a group facing a 4-month deficit, every individual decision about consumption affects everyone. And the obvious modern instinct, protect your own, hold something back, quietly keep a reserve for your family, turns out to be lethal in that setting for a reason that isn't moral. A lone person or a single family holding out separately cannot survive a serious winter, and, more importantly, cannot survive the spring that follows it. Restarting a life in March requires other people. It requires hunting partners for when the herds finally return, and hands to help when someone is injured, and people to watch children while others work, and the sheer distributed labor of rebuilding a functioning group from almost nothing. Someone who hoards their way through the cold and emerges alone in the thaw has not outsmarted anybody. They have simply moved the moment of their death from February to April. So sharing in those societies was not sentimentality, and it was not a rule that some wise person invented and everyone politely agreed to follow. It was arithmetic, tested brutally across an unimaginable number of winters, in every cold region humans ever occupied. Groups that pooled their stores and fed whoever had run short held together, and were still a functioning unit when the ground softened. Groups that fractured into competing households, each guarding its own pit, arrived at spring as a collection of weakened individuals who no longer trusted each other. Repeat that contrast a few thousand times. And the sharing groups are the ones with descendants, which is why the norm eventually stopped feeling like a strategy at all. When a behavior is that thoroughly selected for, over that many generations, it stops being a calculation people make and becomes something closer to an instinct, a thing that simply feels wrong to violate, without anyone needing to explain the reasoning. The obligation to feed a person who has nothing, which remains one of the most powerful moral intuitions human beings have, was not reasoned into existence by philosophers. It was carved into the species by winters that killed everyone who tried the alternative. The fourth problem is the last reserve, and it's stored on the body. Fat is a cache you carry. Nobody can steal it. No scavenger can find it. It requires no digging, no hiding, and no memory of where you left it. A person who enters winter carrying substantial body fat has weeks of energy already banked inside them, and in that world, it mattered enormously. This is why the autumn eating pattern in cold climate populations looks the way it does. A period of heavy, deliberate consumption during the season of abundance, then months of steady depletion, feast, then draw down, every single year. That cycle was completely normal, gaining noticeably through late summer and autumn, and being visibly thinner by spring was simply what a year did to a human body, over and over, for hundreds of thousands of years. Your body's willingness to store fat easily and surrender it reluctantly is not a design flaw, and it is not a modern malfunction. It is the last line of defense in exactly this situation. So what did failure look like? Not dramatic. That is the part worth sitting with, because it is nothing like the way we picture death in the cold. A miscalculation made in autumn showed up in February as a slow, quiet narrowing of the possible. The stores run lower than anyone expected. The portions get smaller and then smaller again. People spend more of the day lying still because movement costs calories that nobody can spare, so the camp gets quieter and less active in a way that feeds on itself. Hunting parties go out into empty country, burn energy for 2 days, and come back with nothing, which leaves the group worse off than if they had never gone. And there is no recovery move. That is precisely what makes winter different from every other threat these people faced. A failed hunt in summer is a bad day, and you try again tomorrow in a landscape that still has animals in it. A failed autumn means there is no tomorrow available to try in. The world outside is closed, the food that exists is the food that exists, and the group can only watch the pile shrink, while doing the arithmetic that everyone has already done privately. The weakest go first. And in practice, that most often meant the very young and then the very old who had been quietly eating less for weeks, so the children could eat more, which is why the whole shape of winter survival is preparation rather than endurance. Everything that mattered was decided while it was still warm, by people paying attention to a threat they couldn't yet feel, doing hard work in good weather for a season that hadn't arrived, guided by the memory of people who had seen it before. So come back now to your own winter. It's cold outside, and it doesn't concern you. Your home holds a temperature somebody chose. There's food in the kitchen, and more available within walking distance, in quantities that have nothing to do with the season. You did not spend last autumn calculating whether your household would make it to spring, because that question isn't asked anymore, not because winter got easier, but because the calculation was made for you, permanently, by systems you never see. And the strangest part is what's left over. You still eat more in the cold and crave heavier food. Your body still stores fat readily and surrenders it slowly, still running a program written for a February that no longer comes. The instinct to feed someone who has nothing still lives in you, and it was installed by winters, where letting a neighbor starve meant facing spring with fewer hands. Your ancestors survived the deadliest winters by looking at a pile of food in autumn and getting the answer right. You survive them by not having to ask the question. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. We make videos like this one every week about ancient human behavior, about what your body still remembers, and about the gap between the world you were built for and the one you actually live in. If that is something you want more of, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that this kind of storytelling is worth keeping alive. See you in the next one.